In the brutal world of medieval justice, one person was the final act. In any city, he was the most feared man alive, a walking symbol of the state's ultimate power. He was the executioner, the man handed society's grimmest job. We picture him in a black hood, a silent, monstrous figure with an axe. But this image, the one from legends and movies, is basically a ghost. It hides a reality that was far more complex and honestly tragic. The truth is, the medieval executioner was someone everyone knew. His life was a walking paradox. He was essential for the law, but he lived like an outcast. His hands brought death, but people also sought them out for healing. And the most tragic part, this dreaded job wasn't a choice. It was an inheritance, a curse passed from father to son, trapping whole families in a cycle of shame and isolation for generations. This isn't the story of the monster in the hood. It's the story of the man underneath, the secret lives they led, and the heavy price their families paid for a name nobody dared to say out loud. To be an executioner in medieval Europe was to be a ghost in your own town. You were seen, but never really acknowledged. You were essential, but completely untouchable. This wasn't just social awkwardness. It was a deep and official shunning that shaped every single moment of your life. The stigma was so powerful, it was often given a legal term, infamy, a mark of dishonor that stuck to you like a shroud. This dictated where you could live, who you could marry, and how you could even exist in the world. Of course, the exact rules changed depending on the city and the century, but the pattern was clear. Executioners and their families were forced to live on the literal and figurative edges of society. In many towns, laws required the executioner's home to be outside the main city walls, often near the gallows, the charnel house, or the cemetery, places already tied to death. Some accounts even suggest their homes were sometimes painted a distinct color, a public marker warning everyone else to keep away. The psychological wall was even bigger than the physical one. An invisible bubble of fear surrounded the executioner wherever he went. If he walked through a busy market, the crowd would literally part for him, with people scrambling to avoid even brushing against his clothes. To touch the executioner, even by accident, was believed to bring bad luck or spiritual pollution, a stain so bad it might need a priest to perform a purification ritual. This shunning bled into every part of life. An executioner wouldn't be invited into a respectable citizen's home. The doors of the local church, the very heart of the community, might be closed to them, or they'd be forced to stand in the back, away from everyone else, as if their presence might pollute the holy space. In Prague, one inn famously had a small, solitary cell where the city's headsman could drink alone, safe from the fearful stares of the other customers. This wasn't just about him either. It fell on his whole family with crushing weight. His wife, who almost always came from another executioner family, was hated just as much. But their children carried the heaviest burden. They were born into a world that had already judged them. They were bullied, shunned by other kids, and often couldn't go to the few schools that existed, which were usually run by the church. Their father's job was a shadow they could never outrun, a source of shame they did nothing to earn. Legally and socially, executioners were often thrown in with the most marginalized people: prostitutes, lepers, gravediggers, and criminals. They were seen as dishonorable people, necessary for the state, but fundamentally unclean. This created a terrible environment of suspicion. Because they were forced to live and interact with the so-called underworld, they were constantly seen as part of it, walking a tightrope between being an officer of the law and a despised outcast. Just imagine the psychological toll. To know that your work, ordered by the highest authorities, was the very thing that made you hated. To see fear in the eyes of every person you met. To know your children were suffering because of your name. The life of an executioner was incredibly lonely, a constant reminder of being both vital and vile in the eyes of the world. He was the living embodiment of society's deepest fears about death and punishment, and he had to carry that weight every single day on the lonely edge of a world that needed him but refused to accept him. So why would anyone choose a life like this? The simple, brutal answer is they didn't. The role of the executioner was almost never a choice. It was an inheritance, a grim family heirloom, passed from father to son like a disease. Once a family was marked by this profession, it was nearly impossible to wash the stain off. The stigma was so strong, it created closed-off, multi-generational executioner dynasties all across Europe. It usually started because, frankly, nobody else wanted the job. In the early Middle Ages, an execution might be carried out by a volunteer. The accuser, or even a criminal, offered a pardon to do the deed. But as justice became more organized, cities needed a permanent, professional executioner. Sometimes, the first man in the family line was forced into it. A local lord, needing a sentence carried out, might just point to a man in a crowd and command him to do it. That's what happened to the father of the famous diarist, Frantz Schmidt. Once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The man and his whole family was branded. For the son of an executioner, life offered very few other options. The infamy of his family name was a locked door to any other respectable trade. No guild, not the stonemasons, weavers, or carpenters, would take the son of a headsman as an apprentice. The social and professional blacklisting was absolute. So the only future available was to follow in his father's blood-soaked footsteps. It wasn't a career choice. It was a destiny with almost no hope of escape. The apprenticeship was as grim as you'd think. It started in boyhood. A young son would first be brought to executions just to watch, forced to get used to the sights and sounds of public punishment, to harden his stomach and steady his nerves. As he got older, he'd become his father's assistant. He would learn to handle the tools, not just the sword and axe, but the ropes, the brands, and the terrifying instruments of torture. He'd be taught the gruesome but necessary details of the trade, how to tie a noose just right for a quick death, the exact spot on the neck to strike for a clean beheading, and the human anatomy of pain for when torture was needed. Before he was ever allowed to execute a person, he had to practice. The young Frantz Schmidt famously wrote in his diary that he graduated from chopping the heads off pumpkins to practicing on stray animals, a final, morbid test before he was ready for the scaffold. His first human executions would be done under his father's careful watch. Only after he proved his skill and nerve would he be considered a master of the craft, ready to take over the job himself, or maybe fill a vacancy in a nearby town. This hereditary trap created a strange, insular society. Since the children of executioners were shunned by all respectable families, they had no one to marry but each other. The daughters of executioners married the sons of executioners, creating a web of family ties that connected these outcast dynasties across entire regions. Families like the Sansons in France held the post of Paris's chief executioner for centuries, passing the terrible duty down through the generations. It became so ingrained that the succession was sometimes written into law. Appointments could even fall to children like the 10-year-old Louis Desmarest, who inherited the title from his father in 1664, with a regent filling in until he was old enough. For these families, the job was more than a job. It was their identity, their curse, and their entire social world. They were bound together not just by blood and marriage, but by a shared experience of isolation. They understood the paradox of their lives in a way no one else could. While the world saw them as monsters, inside their own closed ranks, they were just families trying to survive the only way society would let them. The dynasty wasn't a source of pride, but a cage built by prejudice, passed down from one generation to the next. The popular image of the medieval executioner usually involves two things: a black hood and a massive axe. And while that makes for great drama, the reality of the executioner's work was more complex, varied, and required a lot more skill than that caricature suggests. His real toolkit reveals a world of ritual, status, and terrifying pragmatism. First, let's get rid of the hooded executioner myth. While a hood might have been used on a rare occasion to grant anonymity if the executioner's life was in danger, it was far from standard. In most communities, the executioner was a known public official. There wasn't much point in hiding a face that everyone already recognized and avoided. The image of the anonymous, hooded figure is mostly a later invention to amp up the drama. The real executioner did his work in plain sight. Next is the weapon. The axe, while definitely used, wasn't the universal tool for beheadings. In many parts of Europe, especially within the Holy Roman Empire, the preferred instrument was the executioner's sword. This wasn't a battle sword. It was a specialized tool with a broad, heavy blade and a rounded, non-pointed tip. This design signified it was for justice, not combat. Beheading by sword was seen as a more honorable death, often reserved for nobles or high-status citizens because it was considered cleaner and required more skill. A famous example is Anne Boleyn's execution. Henry VIII specifically brought over a skilled swordsman from France to ensure it was done swiftly. The axe was more often used for less precise work or for common criminals. A successful execution demanded huge skill and anatomical knowledge. The goal, especially in a beheading, was a single clean strike. An executioner who botched the job and took multiple swings, as tragically happened to Mary, Queen of Scots, was seen as incompetent and cruel. A mistake like that could have serious consequences. A furious crowd, enraged by the victim's prolonged suffering, might actually attack the executioner. If he survived, he could be punished by the authorities, facing jail time or losing his fee. There was intense professional pressure to be precise. Beyond the sword and axe, the executioner's toolkit was a horrifying collection of instruments for a whole spectrum of punishments, fatal and not. Public executions were meant to be a show, a visceral warning to everyone, and the methods were tailored to the crime. For the worst crimes, like treason, there was the ghastly punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, famously used on William Wallace in 1305. This involved being dragged to the gallows, hanged until almost dead, then disemboweled while still alive, before finally being beheaded and cut into 4 pieces for public display. The breaking wheel was another instrument of unimaginable agony. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use a heavy iron bar to systematically shatter their limbs. The broken body would then be woven into the wheel and hoisted on a pole, left to die of shock and exposure. A gruesome warning to all. Burning at the stake was reserved for crimes seen as a corruption of the soul itself, like heresy. The deaths of figures like Joan of Arc were powerful public rituals meant to symbolically cleanse the community of spiritual pollution. And the tools of torture used to get confessions were just as varied. The rack stretched the body until joints popped. The tongue terror was a vicious pincer-like tool used on blasphemers. Water torture forced the victim to ingest huge amounts of water. The executioner was the master of all these devices, a technician of pain who had to know exactly how much pressure to apply to get a confession without accidentally killing the accused before their trial was over. The executioner wasn't a mindless brute. He was a specialist, a grim artisan whose work required a steady hand, an iron stomach, and a deep practical knowledge of the human body's breaking points. His tools weren't just for killing. They were instruments of state power, each chosen to send a specific, terrifying message. While the executioner's main job cast him as a dealer of death, his life was full of startling paradoxes. To survive, he had to take on a bunch of other shunned, but essential public duties. And in the biggest irony of all, the man whose touch was considered toxic was also sought out for his unique ability to heal. Executions themselves were relatively rare, certainly not enough to provide a steady income. So to make ends meet, the state gave the executioner a host of other dishonorable tasks that nobody else would touch. He was often the city's designated handler of all things impure. He frequently served as the local knacker, responsible for disposing of dead animals, a foul but necessary job. He was tasked with cleaning public latrines, managing stray dogs, and even overseeing the town's brothels and leper houses. In some places, he acted as a sort of tax collector for the margins of society, getting fees from prostitutes and lepers. Each of these jobs, while providing money, only made him seem more associated with filth and sin in the public's mind. In return for this social exile, the authorities gave the executioner some unusual perks. He often got free lodging in that shunned house on the edge of town and was typically exempt from taxes. One of the strangest perks was the right of havage. This allowed the executioner to take a portion of the goods being sold at the market for free. He would walk through the stalls, often using a special long spoon so he wouldn't have to touch the produce directly, and claim his share. Many vendors, fearing his unclean money or just wanting him to leave, would give him what he wanted. It was a weird form of public subsidy, a way for the community to support the man they hated. But the most incredible paradox is the executioner's role as a healer, especially in certain parts of Europe. His work, which involved dismembering human bodies, gave him a practical, hands-on knowledge of human anatomy that often blew past what university-trained physicians knew at the time. He knew the skeleton, the muscles, and the organs intimately. This grisly expertise made him a surprisingly good folk doctor. People who would publicly shun him would secretly sneak to his door at night, desperate for medical help they couldn't get anywhere else. Executioners were known to be skilled at setting broken bones, treating dislocations, and healing difficult wounds. They also oversaw a grim kind of pharmacy based on the bodies of the executed. There was a widespread belief in corpse medicine, the idea that parts of a dead body held powerful cures. The executioner would sell poor sinners' fat, human fat rendered from executed criminals, used as a salve for all sorts of ailments. A piece of the hangman's rope was thought to cure epilepsy, and the touch of a dead man's hand was believed to get rid of tumors and rashes. For a price, you could even get blood, bones, or other gruesome relics believed to hold a spark of life. This created an unbelievable social dissonance. The executioner was both the most feared and, in some circles, one of the most sought-after medics around. He was a man with two faces, the public agent of death on the scaffold and the secret healer in the shadows. This strange duality shows the deep contradictions at the heart of medieval life, where superstition, faith, and desperate pragmatism all tangled together. To really get inside the secret life of an executioner, we don't need to look at legends. We can look at the life of one real man, Meister Frantz Schmidt, the executioner of Nuremberg from 1578 to 1617. Schmidt's life is incredibly well documented because he left behind a personal journal, a detailed record of every punishment he carried out over his 45-year career. This diary gives us an unprecedented, humanizing look into the mind of a man forced into one of history's most hated jobs. Like so many others, Schmidt's fate was sealed by his father, who was forced into the profession against his will. Frantz had no choice but to follow. He started his career in 1573 when he was 18, and his journal tracks 361 executions and 345 other punishments like floggings or disfigurements. But the journal is more than just a grim list. It shows a man who took his work seriously and professionally. He didn't see himself as a killer, but as a public servant, an officer of the law. His notes detail the crime, the punishment, and sometimes even his own thoughts on the case. Schmidt's life perfectly captures the paradoxes of the job. While he was the agent of death for hundreds, his true passion was healing. It's been estimated that he treated far more people as a doctor than he ever executed. His anatomical knowledge, gained on the scaffold, made him a respected healer. His diary shows a man who would have chosen medicine as his career if society had let him. People feared his public persona, but secretly sought out his private skills. He was also a man who tried to bring a strange kind of mercy to his brutal work. He was known for his efficiency, always aiming for a quick, clean death to minimize suffering. His journal shows that he successfully begged the city council to change drowning sentences for women convicted of infanticide to the more honorable and less agonizing death by the sword. He even seems to have personally resisted carrying out burnings for homosexuality, a punishment required by law, only performing 2 in his entire career, both for counterfeiting money. This was a man working inside a brutal system, but still trying to live by his own code. Despite his professionalism and the considerable wealth he gained, he lived in a large house and earned a salary as high as the city's top lawyers. The stigma of his job haunted him. He was still an outcast, and he was determined that his children would not suffer the same fate. This became his final mission. After he retired, Schmidt spent years petitioning the emperor, arguing that he had served the city honorably and that his family name should be cleansed of its infamy. In an amazing turn of events, he won. In 1624, the Emperor Ferdinand II declared him and his descendants honorable, officially ending the family curse and allowing his children to enter other trades and marry into respectable society. Frantz Schmidt's story is a powerful look at the human being behind the grim title. He wasn't a monster, but a complex man trapped by birth into a brutal role. He navigated a world of contradictions, healer and killer, outcast and wealthy citizen, a dealer of pain who is desperate for honor. His life, so carefully documented, tears down the myth of the blood-spattered brute and replaces it with the portrait of a faithful executioner, a man who found a way to keep his humanity while doing society's most inhuman work. His victory wasn't just for himself. It was for the very idea that a man should be judged not by his job, but by his character. If you find these hidden stories from the darker corners of history compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the past.